Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Exchanges. Thank you so much to you guys out there that have been listening, watching, or wherever it is that you've got this podcast so far. It means that we can bring it back for a second season, which is really, really exciting. And therefore I needed to get a guest that probably needs no introductions at all, and that is Alan Oster. If you don't know who he is, then you clearly haven't been watching economics in Australia for the last 40 years. He is a doyen of this space. Do also therefore want to point out that he does have an incredibly good little short take podcast out there called Oster's Takes, and it's something you should definitely listen to. But I wanted to get him in to go through everything that is currently pretty much turning the dial in Australian economics and Australian markets overall, to get his take, his understanding, his views on the RBA going forward, the Productivity Commission roundtable, all of that and beyond. So with that, here is Alan Oster for the first episode of Season 2. Alan Oster, welcome to Exchanges. I have to start with the biggest news that sort of happened in the last week, which is the RBA somehow surprising pretty much everybody and not cutting rates. What's your 2 cents on what happened?
Look, I think they just wanted extra time. I think prior to we got the 12 months to May inflation data, I was where they're not going to go in July, they go in August. Then I saw the inflation data, and it's not so much, it's volatile, but it also gives you some information that will go into the full quarterly CPI.
Yeah.
And on that basis, you get a 0.6 or 0.7, which would get you to 2.6, 2.7 for 12 months to inflation in the trim mean, which I would have said means you go. They obviously said, nah, we're still thinking the economy's okay. The labour market's still hanging in there, although it's not anymore after today.
Yes.
But, I just think it just says, well, they just wanted more time. I don't think it's a pivot. I'm still happy with the idea that they'll go in August, they'll go in November, then maybe February. That gets them down to about 3.1%. And I think that's pretty neutral. And that's where I think they need to be.
So you've sort of highlighted something that I think a lot of people picked up on, which is the monthly CPI read.
Yeah.
Are they basically still saying that it's too noisy, that it's basically created more issues rather than actually consistency, with the fact that because it isn't showing, the full gamut of the basket, that it is volatile with, when they get particularly construction activity? I found very interesting that they highlighted in durable goods. Do we therefore need to suggest, until the ABS gets it right, that it needs to be turned off?
I don't think they'll turn it off. In fact, by the end of the year, they've got a procedure whereby they'll have a full monthly CPI. RBA, you have to be a bit careful, because in the past, they'd actually take notice of those monthly numbers. This time they decided, for whatever reason, they're not taking any notice. And so they talked about, the March trim mean at 2.9. That's higher than we thought, but there's no way it's going to be 2.9 by the 30th of July, when the full June quarter comes out. So I think it was just a convenient excuse, and does it make any difference in terms of whether it's July or August? Answer's no. The reason I said August, November and February is really very simple, and that is that every second month of the quarter, the Reserve Bank reviews its forecasts.
Mm-hmm.
And everything else. And it also, just before that, gets the full quarterly CPI. So if you're going to bet on timing, it's August, November and February.
Which makes complete and utter sense in terms of what's going on. They pretty much highlighted, and Michelle Bullock's press conference, she was saying that pretty clearly, that they need the quarterly data, and that's sort of where we're at. So the next part of that question that sort of comes about is, they were criticised for being too slow on the way up. They're now being criticised for being too slow on the way down. Overall, though, have they treaded the path, the narrow path, as they like to use the term, well, or are we still waiting to find the answer to that?
I think they've done pretty well. I think Phil Lowe clearly regrets saying that they weren't going to increase rates until 2024. So that was forward guidance. And that's what Michelle Bullock is trying to avoid desperately. She's saying, I'm not giving any forward information. I'm just looking at the data. I I think the Reserve has done quite well because unlike a number of other economies, you could say the Fed, you could certainly say New Zealand, they just crashed their economy.
Yeah.
And so what the Reserve Bank is sort of doing is trading off the employment implications and trading off the core inflation numbers. And the core inflation numbers, if you go in terms of the March quarter, were good, but they were not brilliant. But all the partial data since then has been weakening, and so why would that not turn up in a couple of weeks' time? So that's sort of where I was at. But I think they've got us to a pretty good spot. I mean, and as we go forward, I think in 12 to 18 months' time, when the economy is growing at, let's say, 2, unemployment probably will still have a 4 in front of it. The target for inflation will be back in the range, and fiscal and basically monetary policy will be neutral. I reckon that'll be very, very attractive to offshore investors. So I think the medium term is actually pretty good.
I'd have to agree. And I think, again, from their view, that's probably what the narrow path is, which is to get to that point that you've just described. But that also then brings in other parts that gets quite noisy. First and foremost, I've got to discuss then your view on housing and where housing is at. We are starting to see a reacceleration. We've just seen leaked Treasury documents that suggest that the government's 1.2 million new houses by 2029 is a pipe dream.
It is.
Yeah. Where do you sit on the issue of housing and interest rates, but also the issue of housing and supply? Because this is the next great conundrum.
For me, it's all about supply, and that's the problem. It's demand. You change interest rates, you change negative gearing. It just affects the sort of ability of people to demand more. So for me, I'm a big supporter of the idea that the government builds more in public housing. Private sector, they might give you some incentives to build to rent, as they say. In other words, you build an investment property, people take investments in that property, but they don't then sell it. They rent it for the next 10 to 15 years. And in the States and in the UK, it's like 20 to 30% of the total supply. In Australia, it's nothing. So, and the multipliers from construction, the impact on the economy, are very large and very quick. And so it helps if you do that. Now, interest rates, to me, will make people feel happier or more inclined that they've got their cost of living under control or not as bad as it currently is. And so I think the housing market, to me, needs help on the supply side. I have no problems with the government doing what it's doing, but, as Treasury would say, they're not going to be able to essentially achieve those targets. And how do you fix that? Well, if you're going to have to spend more money in housing and not spend more money anywhere else, you're going to have to somehow raise more revenue.
Yeah. Now I'm going to come back to
that's basically what the Treasury was saying.
Yeah. So I'm going to come back to you on that because that is a topic that we absolutely have to cover. There's two other things I want to ask you first and foremost inside of that. First one, keeping on the supply of housing. The question really is where? So they're talking about if you look at it, I think there was a stat that came out the other day. It's roughly about 30 square k's of housing required to meet that 1.2 million homes in the cities. That's hard to find. So your spending is infrastructure being spent correctly, or they need to raise that to obviously therefore meet those targets? And the second part of that supply question is, do we need to also therefore reevaluate? I mean, we keep hearing about it, but reevaluate how construction particularly is done in housing, because it's obviously done by smaller players and with products that have been pretty much in play for decades. We're not embracing new technology. So the other two questions I have for you is where and the productivity of construction.
Yeah. Where I don't know. I mean, obviously, if you're looking at the housing market at present, Brisbane and to some extent, believe it or not, Adelaide is outperforming.
Yeah, it's credible, right?
Yeah. And Western Australia was booming and now it's not. because that's associated with mining. So I think I would let the property developers pick which areas they think they can make money. Now, one thing that I think is really interesting, you look at construction prices, they're not going at 20% anymore, but they're not going down.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk to property developers, their sort of response for why I'm not going out and doing this is they can't make any money. In other words, by the time you pay for your cement and all the sort of inputs and what you then want to get in return, you can't make money. And so they're not going to do it. And so one of the reasons why, the public sector is falling behind is the private sector is not interested in it. And until you can sort of fix that, I don't know how you fix that. But one of the issues is this is sort of what economists call crowding out in the private sector. So why is cement prices, etc., and you can't get a tradesman? Why is that happening? Well, the answer is because they're building infrastructure and they can't get them. And so that makes it very, very difficult in terms of the medium term.
Yeah, it's the chicken and egg, isn't it?
Yeah. And then your second question was about how do we do better productivity? Well, I don't know. I'm not an expert in the building industry, but I'm sure, I've talked to a lot of property developers who think about, is it time to come back into Melbourne again? Or do I keep, just putting stuff on lorries, etc.? But they're sort of at this stage putting stuff on lorries. So they're not really inclined to invest yet.
Yep. The other question I was going to ask you from your previous answer, and you sort of hit on it again, is the cost of living. So there is a growing thing that, cost of living crisis is over. Is it over or is it more plateaued?
It's plateaued. Yeah. It's not over. You have to be careful. The banks have very low bad debts in the market. What the consumer's doing is they're basically juggling. So what they're saying is, right, I'll try and get an extra part-time work. I'll maybe cut back on what I'm spending or the quality of what I'm spending. And if provided that interest rates will come down significantly, and as I said, 75 points from my point of view, then I can survive. But it's still tough out there. And, we look at consumption, it's 0.3 probably in the June quarter. So it's okay, June month may have gone up a little bit. We'll find out some more data on that. And some of the bank data sort of says it was a little bit better in June. But overall, the economy is not doing very well. So it might go from 1.3 to 1.5. But outside of COVID, 12 months to growth rate of 1.5 is not good. And the other thing that people forget, cost of living is not just in the mortgage belt. Where it's really bad is in essentially the low or the third of the economy that essentially rents. There's no supply for rent. That's even worse there. And in some markets like Victoria, where you have lots of, and I can understand why people without economic training would say, well, let's just make sure the landlord doesn't put up the price and let's just get extra revenues from land tax or whatever. The problem with that is the sort of investor then says, stuff this, I'm just going to sell, and whoever buys. And so the stock of rental properties goes down, not up. And so that just makes it even worse. So, and, back in the days when I was in NAB and we'd get to see what was happening in some of the various charities, it's really tough and it's not getting much better. So plateauing would be the answer.
Yeah, that's an amazing point. So what you're highlighting there is that, families that traditionally or individuals that traditionally wouldn't fall into charity areas are falling into charity areas.
They're in there now. Yeah. And even things, one of the other ones that I was worried about was one of the fastest growing area of new lending on these charities were basically for car registrations. And why car registrations? People are living in their cars. And if you don't have it registered, the cops come and get it.
Yep.
So it's still very tough out there.
Yeah, that I think that's what is sometimes missed in this whole discussion around this is I agree with you, which I'm coming to what I want to talk about, which is that we are moving into this productivity roundtable. But before we get there, you highlighted something that I think, will absolutely be part of this discussion, but needs to be discussed more and more by particularly people like yourself now that you're also independent, and that you're obviously even more of a voice that
Yeah.
can actually say your own piece, is
Yeah.
the way taxation works in this country and the way that, land tax, payroll tax from state bases and the impacts that they're having, the terminology around, progressive tax and regressive tax, I think is also part of the discussion here. So let's start that. We know
Yeah.
that we are running headlong, I would argue, into a structural nightmare around the tax in this country. We are hearing more and more prominent people talk about, this productivity round table in mid-August about tax. Let's start with that.
Yep.
What
So,
what are your views?
okay, a few facts to start off on tax.
Yes.
As a percent of GDP, Australia is a low taxing country. The problem is they get all their revenue either from PAYE, the consumer, or from company. So they have a really bad distribution
Yeah.
in
Can I
terms
can
of,
I just I'm just going to stop you there, because I think that point is what I get a lot when I say the same thing. They're like, "Oh, but we're one of the lowest taxing countries on the planet." I'm like, "But it's how we tax. It's not about the
yes,
percentage.
no,
It's about how we tax, right?"
yep. And so I think there's an important question about the efficiency of spending of government. So there's sort of two questions. Question number one, will you keep spending the same rate as you think you want to? And if you do, then you need to increase your revenue and do it better or more productively. I would hope that they would also say, well, maybe we shouldn't just keep spending forever at that rate, because that just makes it really tricky. Um, if you wanted to raise more revenue, I think you would want to do a couple of things. One, politically, you'll never get up, GST. So, I've heard people say, well, everywhere else in the world is 15%. And I
Yeah.
lived in France at the OECD. They don't have an income tax. They just get everything out of GST. And so what you could do is put up the GST a bit. Now, whether the Commonwealth keeps it or gives some more to the states, but they get some more revenue that way, you could then offset some of the negativity in terms of the distribution, because everybody, if you're really wealthy and, you pay 10%, or if you're really poor, you've still got to pay 10%.
Yeah.
So if it goes to 15, then you need to help the bottom end of the income distribution. Other things that I think I would look carefully at would be essentially land tax, and whether you move. I think the ACT is in the process of moving to a small income tax that essentially just says, right, well, your house is worth X. We will give you an annual bill of a couple of $1,000, but you'll have to phase it in, because if someone's just paid land tax and stamp duty, then you'd be better off essentially. Well, you'd have the problem. You'd have to have a 10-year period where you go through certain periods and say, right, well, you're exempt from that tax until you've paid for your stamp duty and land tax. So I'd be looking very carefully at that. And then I suppose I'll come back to something I've said before. I think you've got to look at the supply side, and how can you not only get the government spending more, how can you encourage the private sector to actually invest to rent, and get the idea that I'm a renter and I'm going forward, and I'll sign a 10-year contract or 5-year contract or something, but that's where I'm getting my income stream from, not the fact that I have to sell it and make the money that way.
Yeah, interesting. I find that fascinating, because the GST is the interesting one. I agree with you that politically, I mean, it's actually technically, it's already been ruled out. I mean, I wanted to get back to GST, and those consumption taxes are described as regressive, right? They're described as regressive taxes because, as you said, it impacts the poor more than it impacts the wealthy. The difference is that obviously the efficiency of it's quite high. If you look at the numbers on what we did last year with GST revenue, I think it was about $84 billion in if you look at the extra 5%, I think it's about $42 billion in extra revenue. If the government was to keep that, the federal government that is, then surely you could start talking about personal income tax, because that is a progressive tax, right? Is personal income tax. So my next question for you is, why can we not address the fact that we now have also a scenario where boomers, which are nearly 1 in 5 Australians, that are en masse going to retire probably by the end of 2030? What are they going to do about that, massively shrinking pie? Because 60% of revenue for the government, federal that is, comes from personal income tax. What are they going to do to address
that? There's a massive wealth redistribution going to come on in this process.
Is it inheritance tax? Is that what you're sort of suggesting? Is that
I don't like inheritance taxes, I must admit. I know, and a lot of people do, but my sort of answer is anyone who's got a lot of financial advisors will get around it.
Yep.
So they okay, it won't be perfect. And the other thing is to me, what you do is you don't save anymore. Why would you save it to give it to the government? So all the incentives to save and be prudent go out the window, and I just don't like it much. And I see what happens in France when I lived there, and in the UK, where as soon as someone has a property and then they sell it, they spend the rest of their life trying to figure out ways to pay the inheritance tax. And I just think that's an even worse outcome. But I think what you've got to maybe you can't increase the rate of the GST, but you could make it broad based. Rather than just the old.
Could you rip up the states? Could you rip up the state agreements?
That would be difficult.
Yes, it would be.
And that's part of the problem that the way they put the GST in was that all the states have got to all agree, and even if a tiny little one disagrees, it doesn't work.
Game over. Yeah,
so it's game over. So the chance. So that's, I can remember Costello saying, "Well, that guarantees it'll never get changed." But things are slightly different. We now have an NDIS. We have defence issues, and we just have to figure out how we're going to split the pie and make it the most efficient way we can do it, so that it's not actually a big problem in relying just on essentially personal income tax and company income tax. And even company income tax, I'm less inclined to worry about it, because it's really just, we're a little bit uncompetitive. But if we're a good economy with a good legal system, close to Asia, et cetera, all those things say that is an attraction. And if the Australian economy could do the productivity thing better, it would be so much simpler. And a simple way to think about it is, our productivity is growing around 1%. I've been in the economics game for 40 years. I've never seen the OECD average for productivity growth being above Australia, which is where it currently is. So, if you think of it, if you can get productivity at 2 rather than 1, it means that wages can go at 4 and you still get inflation down to 2. So the whole world would, you have lower interest rates and the economy will run much more efficient. And finally, the other thing, I think the government's aware of this, is the red tape thing. That you may have someone who comes in with great qualifications, but they're not recognised, or they're different between various regions. And if you could address some of those issues, I think the government is a little bit sympathetic to that. In the last budget, you had this thing about you can't compete, and they tried to water those rules down a bit. And I'll use the example that I use all the time. So I go off to my local dentist, and they have a hygienist, I think is the word for it. The hygienist is actually a fully qualified, in fact, more qualified than my dentist, but she lived in Brazil. And so her qualifications are not recognised here.
Yep.
It's crazy.
And so this is the big question, right, around when you talk, because you and I talk about this all day, because it's obviously what we do, and we're economists by training, et cetera. And productivity, when we use this term, it glazes people over. And they also hear the term productivity, which is, do more with less. right? They
Yeah.
hear that straight out, that they do more
Yep.
with less. Can you first and foremost debunk how that term is used? But second, as you just pointed out with your dentist description, which I think is beautiful, that productivity doesn't actually have to be that much of a tweak. It could happen really quite readily, as you said, with allowing to drop red tape, allowing the recognition of, let's go further back to the construction industry. Builders that come into this country are not recognized unless they're out of New Zealand or to some extent the UK. So
Yep.
can you first and foremost debunk like less with more, but also
Okay.
about what we could do to improve productivity quite quickly?
It's not so much less than more. It's with the same inputs, you can get more output.
Yeah.
So people talk about labour productivity. And fortunately, when you read it in the newspapers, most people think, oh, they're going to sack somebody.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what you want. What you want is you've got three things. You've got the efficiency of your capital. So you got, let's call it $3 of. So you've got $1 of labour input, you've got $1 of capital input, and you've got $1 of technology. So what you're trying to do is with the same amount of inputs, get more than $3 out. Whereas, you might have had 111 and you got 3, maybe 4 if you're lucky. Now you want 5 for your output. So it's more that you get more value for money from all of your inputs, labour, capital, and technology. And if you do that, then that helps the economy a lot. And the other problem that you get about talking in productivity, and this was when I worked at the OECD, they used to always say that, the sinners are grinners and the good guys are bad. Because what happens is as soon as you get some sort of measure that's good for the economy, there'll be a small but very vocal group of people who will complain like hell. The majority of people who will actually get a lot better output from this don't say anything. And so you always have a big difficulty in doing something that's good for the medium term output from the economy. And so to me, that's the way you should look at productivity. How can I use the inputs that I've currently got and use them better and get a better outcome? And whether that means more labour or less labour, it really depends on how you use that in combination with capital and technology.
So then at the round table, let's say you're sitting there, Alan, what would you be advocating to meet that?
I would be, I'd say two things. One, I want the cost of the government spending to come down a little bit. Now they can figure out which bit they want. They've got departments who do that sort of stuff, and I don't want them to sort of cause issues associated with the drivers of the economy can't get the inputs they need. The second thing is, okay, let's assume that I'm going to try and get this certain amount of government spending. How can I fund it better? And to me, that says indirect taxes and GST, but I don't think it'll happen. Or therefore, it might be somehow improve the efficiency and the reliability of the indirect tax system. And that can be things like, as I said, moving away from stamp duty to a sort of an annual income tax and have less impact on the economy.
Yes, it'll be interesting to see if they actually can do those kinds of things and move there. Look, I could ask you so many questions, but our time, unfortunately, is coming to an end, Alan. So as I always do when I finish up these interviews, I ask the big, broad, massive question, which is, Alan Oster, if you were in charge for just one day, what would you do?
Okay, not popular, won't happen. I'd increase the GST. or I would broaden it.
Yeah.
So the indirect tax base somehow generates more money, which allows me to pull back on income tax and company tax.
But I think that's a reasonable comment. Like I don't think that's controversial anymore. And I think that's what's also so fascinating about the debate that's going on. This is the loudest I've actually seen that discussion be. I mean, and it's across the spectrum, and it's not just, left, right. It's not just economists, etc. It's starting to come from all persuasion. So I think your call is absolutely there. And I think the more and more education around why GST increasing is not a massive impact here and now that everybody sees it as. Because as you said, if you could argue, then you're going to get an increase in everything that you buy, but you're going to have more money in your pocket if you're a lower socioeconomic group by raising
Yeah.
the bottom band from, what is it now, 20 grand or thereabouts. It's moving up to a bit higher. But if it could move up to 50, I mean, or even $40,000, that impact is incredible. Because then they're back at 15%, which is, what they're used to anyway. The spread therefore gets higher. My question also for you then is, indexation. Can we start having the question around indexation?
Sorry, that's one I should have come back.
That's
we
right.
should definitely index the tax scales.
Yeah.
Not just on unrealized capital gains, but on everything. Because, what sort of happens is bracket creep. Just works. And then the governments come in and what they do is they say, oh, I'm not doing anything. And then suddenly, just before the election, they give everybody a tax cut. which sort of gets us back to where we started, or maybe not as much. And it's just...
the inefficiency of capital there, right? Isn't it? So all of that money that could have been sitting in, as you said, if we don't have the ability to save because we don't want to, because we're giving it to the government, is all part of it. I mean, that tax break that could have been compounding interest is there. I mean, again, we've gone a bit further. I'm going to ask this question because I need to come back to it. The other one I didn't talk to you about, and I need to get your input on, is superannuation. And the fact that superannuation is an incredible idea and concept, and it's a beautiful thing. We're very lucky in Australia to have it. It is creating a haves and have-nots. It is also distorting the tax system, I would argue, in the fact that it's so, beneficial for putting more and more capital into it with the 15% tax break. Plus, the next question I have for you is that once you retire in this country, we're one of only 3 countries to not tax pension phase. Do we have to look at super around the way that we tax it and the current generosity that is inside it?
I think the short answer to that is yes. It's very generous. Forget about unrealized capital gains, which is a different issue.
That's different.
But it's a big incentive if you're just the man in the street to put all your money in super. Yeah. And it also produces some pretty bad policy outcomes because the government just basically forever thinks of something that I really like to do this. I might want to build some more infrastructure and tell us, the various areas of the government who have the super, you guys have got to basically spend it on that. You direct, the super funds to go and put it in X, which will cause all sorts of issues.
Yep. And again, inefficiency of capital distribution and picking winners and all those kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
Alan, it has been an absolute fabulous exchange. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Evan.
Big thank you to Alan, and thank you so much to him for being part of the new program, the new setup. I do really recommend you get onto Oster's Takes. They are great, really good little bite-sized pieces. So please, if you haven't, go and have a look at Alan's stuff. Also, don't forget, same here, please, if you haven't already, subscribe to wherever it is that you're listening to this, whether it's on podcasts, whether it's on YouTube or whatever medium you're looking through. Please, if you can, subscribe, because the more we get on the subscribers, the more seasons I can put out and the more guests that I can get you on here. Big thank you also for listening. I need to say that straight out and foremost is that it is a real pleasure to bring you these going forward, and I have loved doing the first 20 and hopefully many more to come into the future. If you do have any questions, responses, ideas, guests, etc., we do have an email. It's exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. But until next week, thank you for tuning in to the start of Season 2.